On the 29th of July 1981, 750 million people from across the world were watching a wedding from their television screens. More than 2 million people stood on the streets of London, all the way from the royal residence at Clarence House to St. Paul's Cathedral, to witness what seemed like a match made by God himself. The People's Princess, Lady Diana Spencer, was marrying the heir to the world's most influential monarchy, Prince Charles III.
I pronounce that they be man and wife together, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
A kiss, which receives a roar of approval from the crowd, who called the couple back and back again onto the balcony. And every single one was rewarded by this tender kiss.
As all of Britain celebrated and people took onto the streets to catch a glimpse of the $110 million wedding procession, an 8-year-old Indian boy mysteriously vanished blocks away from the wedding of the century and was never seen alive again. This is the story of that one day and that one boy. This is the story of Vishal Mehrotra. Hi everyone, welcome to the Desi Crime Podcast, a show where we dive deep into some of the craziest cases from around South Asia. I'm your host Aishwarya.
And I'm Aryan.
And the case that I have for you today is unlike anything we have covered on this podcast ever before. But before we start the case for today, I want to thank the most significant source for today's episode, BBC Sound's podcast on the case titled Vishal, investigated and narrated by Sachin Mehrotra and Colin Campbell. Sachin is Vishal's half-brother, born decades after Vishal disappeared, and Colin is a dedicated journalist whose tireless efforts became the single-handed light of justice in this case. For an even deeper dive into the case, we urge you to listen to Vishal by BBC Sounds, wherever you get your podcasts.
Guys, I've been begging Aishwarya to cover this case.
Yep.
When she gave me the TLDR version, I was like, Princess Diana is mysterious enough. But an Indian boy disappearing on the day of her wedding is something I've never heard of. So in the same manner that I begged her to cover this episode for you guys, I beg you to subscribe to this podcast, subscribe to our channel or to Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast so that, we can keep the engines running here at the Desi Studios.
I think you all should subscribe just because of these ingenious subscribe little shout outs that Aran comes up with. I think they're hilarious. Go subscribe somewhere here.
I don't think that's a good enough reason, but thank you.
Chapter 1. A Fairy Tale and a Nightmare. For this case, there is no other moment in time to start but the day everything changed. The day 20-year-old Diana Frances Spencer married Prince Charles III and became Diana, Princess of Wales, in a wedding that even today is the 4th most watched television broadcast in the history of the world. It was the 29th of July 1981, and while Britain was in turmoil from unprecedented levels of poverty, unemployment, racial tensions and border conflicts with Ireland, on this day, for those chosen few hours, the country was truly experiencing joy. At 10:22 a.m. that morning, Princess Diana and her father John Spencer sat in a glass carriage with 8 other carriages in a convoy behind her, which took them and the rest of the royal family to St. Paul's Cathedral for the wedding. It took the carriages an hour to make the 2-kilometer journey as they navigated the 2 million bystanders who celebrated alongside them, only wanting to catch a glimpse of the beautiful princess who had won hearts worldwide. Due to border tensions at the time, the fact that the Queen had been shot at during a public procession just a month ago, and the fact that this was an infamous time in UK history with serial killers like the Yorkshire Ripper on the prowl, every ounce of police force in the city was on duty for the event. 4,000 police officers, 2,200 military officers, and multiple sharpshooters adorned the streets and buildings that day. They were perhaps the only people in the country that day not allowed to watch the wedding. Their purpose was to protect it by keeping their back on the wedding and eyes on the crowd instead. Now, people weren't just out on the streets watching. People who were lucky enough to have offices or homes that faced the wedding procession held parties inside those buildings too, where they invited friends, family, and co-workers.
Ash, I know you've watched that Netflix show called The
Crown.
Crown that covers the story of the royals in the UK. I haven't, and I know nothing about Princess Diana except her mysterious demise.
Right.
Why was she such a beloved figure?
I think Aranji had this quality of being a very nurturing leader in the face of a monarchy that can otherwise seem rather cold and distant with its protocols. She was also, for the time, an incredibly strong-willed woman. So at this wedding, actually, there was a part where she was supposed to say in her vows that she will obey Prince Charles III, which she refused to say on the day of the wedding. So she had these like incredibly nurturing qualities that juxtaposed to her really strong-willed nature.
An endearing rebel.
An
of
enduring
sorts.
rebel, precisely. And then I think just the scandal with the affair later on made the world feel like they felt for her because she went through so much. On this day, people who had apartments or office buildings that faced the wedding were hosting these lavish parties. And one such office was that of Vishal Mehrotra, or Vishu as people lovingly called him. Working as a young lawyer in bustling London at the time, the office of the law firm he worked at was perfectly situated to view the wedding. Quote, I was working on Fleet Street as a solicitor, and that is why we went to the party on the royal wedding day, because my office was on the second floor, literally overlooking Fleet Street. So we had the best view. We had a party. Everybody came. The partners came. Their families were there. The kids were there. End quote. By 11 a.m. that morning, Vishu was in his office with his two kids, 8-year-old Vishal and 7-year-old Mamta, along with the kids' nanny, Vanita. Vishu had been married previously to a woman named Aruna. Aruna and Vishu had met in India at the age of 25 after Vishu had returned to India once he finished his education in the UK. The two went on to give birth to both their kids in India and raised them there for a few years, but when Vishu's father passed away abruptly and he experienced a serious nervous breakdown, he made the decision to move back to the UK with his family in 1978, just 3 years before the day of the royal wedding. But in the UK, Vishu and Aruna's marriage collapsed, after which Aruna made the decision to return to India, where she began her own jewelry business, leaving her kids back in the UK with Vishu. Navigating life as a single parent, a day like this one, the day of the royal wedding, was his opportunity to bond with his children, and the family was excited. Mamta, who was 7 at the time and is 50 today, remembers the energy of the day vividly. It was like the most exciting thing. We had heard about this royal wedding for months. We all wanted to see it. It was exciting. We all had to dress up. We would go to Dad's office, look decent. I had a dress on. With all of the kids, I don't think the parents would have wanted us to go into the town in the main crowd. That's why we had our own kind of vantage point, which was safe for all of us, right? It was the office, my dad's office, end quote. As an hour and a half passed inside the office and the adults all got progressively more drunk, the kids all lined up by the window to watch the commotion below as Princess Diana's carriage passed the area at 12:45 p.m. The office erupted in cheer, with flags waving and claps and screams from outside echoing inside. But not little Vishal, Mamta remembers. He didn't really care about the royals. He was more fascinated by the commotion inside the office as he played with other kids. He was unlike other kids his age in many regards, including being fiercely independent too. Once the carriage had passed and the princess had arrived at St. Paul's Cathedral, there was nothing on the streets below left to see. And so with drinks and food done with, Vishu decided it was time to head back home by about 1 p.m. They needed to get back before the wedding ended, and Princess Diana and Prince Charles made the trip back to Buckingham Palace, crowding the streets once again. It was time for an afternoon nap now, and so the Mehrotras left the office with their nanny, headed for Temple Station, and boarded a train towards their home in West London. Once the family and the nanny Vanita got off at the East Patney station, the station closest to their home, something hit them. The fact that 2 million people were all gathered next to St. Paul's Cathedral and others were cooped up in their homes watching the event on TV meant that the rest of London was empty and dead and silent like never before. Pin drop silence. It was like a ghost town, is how they described it. From this station, the plan was to head straight home because they were all really tired. But Vishu remembered something. They were all traveling to Jersey the next day for a small holiday, but Vishal had a slight cough. He needed to make sure they had some cough medicine so he'd be fine on the trip. And so he told the nanny Vanita to take the kids to the nearest pharmacy and pick up the medicine while he heads home and recuperates so the trip next day can be smooth. He even gave his kids some money so they could buy some candy on the way back home for themselves, and with that, he said goodbye to them, not knowing it was going to be the last time he would see his baby boy alive again. Quote, what has happened is that I've walked home. I'm of the opinion that they're all three together. I reach home. I'm so tired. I literally go to bed and I must have fallen asleep in 5 minutes, said Vishu, recounting that day. Back at the station, Vanita and the kids begin to head towards the pharmacy, but halfway through, Vishal says he's tired too and really doesn't want to walk anymore and just wants to go back home. But Vanita says no to letting him walk back alone. You see, Vishal constantly fought for more independence, always in a battle with his dad to let him walk to school alone, and even getting the nanny to stand in a different cabin of the train where she watched him only so he could feel that ounce of adulthood. But this afternoon, Vanita said no, at least initially. Vishal fought Vanita as he always did. Mamta fought him too, saying she'll go back home with him, but he just wouldn't agree. And finally, Vanita relented. Vishal was going to go home alone, but Mamta was going to stay with her. She was younger than Vishal after all, and a girl too. She wasn't going alone. And with that, 8-year-old Vishal turned away from his nanny and sister, ran across a street he had walked alone countless times in the past, and headed to his home just 10 minutes away on the empty streets when Vanita and Mamta headed towards the pharmacy. That was it. That was the last time they saw Vishal alive. When Vanita and Mamta returned home at around 2:33 p.m. that afternoon, they immediately noticed Vishal wasn't home, and it stood out to them. But there was a street party that day in the park right next to their house, and so both of them arrived at the conclusion that Vishal was out there in the street party preparations with his friends. And so they too fell asleep like Vishu, full well believing Vishal would be in the house by the time they woke up a couple of hours later. But a couple of hours passed, and Vishu, Mamta and Vanita all woke up to no sign of Vishal. Now, Vishu had moved to London, yes, but he was a strict parent. His son wasn't home and he needed him back now. Then the frantic dad assumed that maybe his son went on a drive with some of his friends, which I just want to point out is kind of an odd thing to assume for an 8-year-old, because how old are your 8-year-old's friends to the point that they can drive? Unless I'm missing some key context here, like Vishu assuming that Vishal's friend's parents took him on a drive. This is just an odd detail to me otherwise. Vishu makes call after call after call to neighbors and parents of Vishal's friends, but again, no sign of Vishal. Nobody had seen him that afternoon after he left Vanita and Mamta. By 7:40 p.m. that evening, all neighbors and friends had been called, and it was beginning to seem like Vishal had vanished into thin air from the empty London streets. And so it was at 7:40 that Vishu called the Metro Police and reported his 8-year-old son missing. By 8 p.m., Mamta had been put to sleep as Vishu spoke to 2 police officers, Officer Jackie Moulton and Sean Keep, in his house, filing a missing persons report for Vishal. Jackie Moulton remembers meeting Vishu for the first time that night and not knowing if shaking his hand was appropriate for a moment of such sorrow. And so Moulton just went in and hugged Vishu instead, a moment of kindness everyone remembers decades later. Mamta remembers that night too, as she lay in her bed unable to understand the magnitude of the situation, only happy that she didn't have to share her room with Vishal for once. Just one night of privacy, she thought in her baby brain, unaware that nights without Vishal were going to be forever. But the moment the lights in her room went off, his absence dawned on her and her room felt eerie, scary. Quote, I remember the pin-drop silence of sleeping in the room without him there. I had never slept a night without him in my whole life. Since the day I was born, I think, we had been together every day. We had never been apart. My parents were there, but Vishal was always there, she said decades later. As Mamta drifts into sleep, Officer Jackie and Sean begin conducting a search in areas around the house and eventually call back up too. They check the homes of neighbors, nearby parks, under construction buildings, dustbins, and even freezers in nearby shops in case Vishal got stuck somewhere he couldn't get out of. But nothing. Next, they wonder if Vishal fell into one of the many water bodies in London, including the River Thames, and over the course of the next few weeks, they search it all. They drain sewers, send divers into the rivers and dogs into nearby farms. They fly above London in helicopters with thermal imaging cameras, but absolutely nothing. Vishal was seemingly nowhere. Now the theory that Vishal may have been kidnapped needed to be probed a lot more seriously than before. And one of the first few people that came to everyone's mind was Vishal's mother, Vishu's ex-wife, Aruna, who was in India but was flying into London after hearing of Vishal's disappearance. In fact, Vishu was hoping Aruna was the one behind this, because then it would at least mean that Vishal is safe. Nobody hurt him, because Aruna would never do that to her own kid. But Mamta remembers wondering, even back then, why would her mother kidnap her brother, but not her? That was the reason why this theory never made perfect sense to her. This piece just didn't quite fit. The police met Aruna at Heathrow so they could interview her before she entered London and had a chance to talk to anyone else about Vishal. They thought that was their best shot at getting the truth from her. While we don't know exactly how the interrogation with Aruna went, we know the police rather quickly moved on from her. Everyone was a suspect in such early moments, including Aruna, Vishu, and the nanny, but that was only because that's where the police had to start, not because any of them had done anything out of the ordinary or suspicious. And with that, the police now began investigating outside Vishal's immediate family and friend circle. When almost a week passed to Vishal having disappeared, the police put out calls in the news urging anyone who had any information to come forward and contact Scotland Yard. They gave the media Vishal's description. They told them he was dressed in a blue and white striped t-shirt, black corduroy trousers, and blue training shoes. They told them he was last seen outside East Patney Tube Station at 2 p.m. on the 29th, and even created a reconstruction of Vishal's last moments using a Gujarati boy who did not at all look like Vishal and was as tall as the nanny in the recreation, which irritated the family. But the police hoped that all of this information given to the media could help and someone would come forward. And people called. Tens of thousands of people called. And the police ended up chasing 10,000 of those people as possible leads into sightings of Vishal. By this time, 6,000 premises were searched too. But each and every one of those 10,000 people and 6,000 locations led nowhere. Just as there was only vast stretches of nothingness in the ground search for Vishal, there was nothingness from the media search too. As time passed and the family waited and slowly began to lose hope of Vishal ever returning, occasions that were once meant to be happy also came and went. Vishu's 36th birthday came and went on the 3rd of August. And then what was supposed to be Vishal's 9th birthday came and went on the 27th of September too. But the family mourned his absence. Eventually Thanksgiving comes and goes, and then so does Christmas, but it all passes without Vishal. For 7-year-old Mamta, this time was really weird. Unable to comprehend her brother's absence, she was also dealing with seeing her parents live together in the same home for the first time since she was 2 years old, an experience she calls traumatic in a different kind of way. She remembers the conflict between being a child and the sister to a missing kid, recalling how she was once scolded by a random family member for laughing at a Tom and Jerry episode in a time of such sadness. Slowly, as London covers itself in snow, 1981 becomes 1982, and it was in February of 1982 that the Mehrotra family got the call that turned their world upside down. Chapter 2: The Woods of Older Corpse. On the evening of the 21st of February 1982 at around 6 p.m., two brothers left their home to go out hunting in London's countryside. As the men go about their routine shooting pigeons in a wooded area in a part of West Sussex called Older Corpse, one of them notices something in front of him, a small human skull. Around it are other bones too, like the vertebrae and the ribs, some scattered away by wild animals from the wilderness, and others seemingly buried in a 2 feet deep ditch hidden by a large log. Soon the area was swarming with police and forensics teams. While this is happening in the woods, and it isn't confirmed yet whose remains these are, Vishu sits in his office on Fleet Street, the same office he was in with his kids the morning Vishal disappeared, when he gets the phone call that breaks him. The call is from a policeman who informs Vishu that they've most likely found Vishal's remains. There is still a little bit of hope in this moment, hope that the remains aren't of Vishal, but that hope is slowly dying. In the hours after he gets this call, Vishu ends up giving an interview in an attempt to get the public talking about his son again, 7 months after he disappeared. It's a sad interview to watch, and as pointed out in the BBC podcast, there's something deeply insensitive to the questions of the journalist. There's no overt racism or obvious carelessness, but just undertones that sound off.
If these indeed are Vishal's remains, what will that mean to your life here?
But what is even more sad about this interview is how heartbroken Vishu sounds. It's like he knows. He knows those remains out in those woods are his baby boys. And soon after this interview, his worst fears were confirmed. The forensics team used dental analysis to determine the remains belonged to Vishal, discarded shortly after he went missing, forever leaving him only 8 years old. Now, make no mistake, everyone knew Vishal was murdered. This was no accident. His body had been found 50 miles or 80 kilometers from where he was last seen. There's no way Vishal just got lost so far from home and ended up dead in the woods. He had been killed and discarded here. Once it's confirmed that this is Vishal, something very quintessential to crime cases ends up happening in this case too. The case now needs to be handed over to Sussex County, the jurisdiction where his body was found, from the Metropolitan Police, the jurisdiction where he had disappeared. This means that the much smaller Sussex police will now be taking on this incredibly complex case with thousands of case files 7 months after the disappearance and treat it like their own. But the Sussex police would fail. Maybe it isn't fair to say they failed. There's no saying if the Met police would have succeeded if they had the case instead. But the Sussex police, in essence, failed. After Vishal's remains were found, months passed to no news on Vishal's killer or killers. In May of 1982, Vishu travelled to India to cremate whatever remained of his son and say a final goodbye to him by giving away his ashes to the river Ganga. That same year, the couple who got married the day of Vishal's abduction gave birth to their first child, as a different family said goodbye to their first child. Prince William was born, and the world celebrated once again.
Less than 2 days after arriving here, Prince, Princess and baby Prince emerged to the cheers of the crowd. Father held baby, mother held baby, looking equally confident.
But then a decade passed, and 1982 became 1992. Life, while still painful a decade later, seemed to have moved on in some small and some key ways. Aruna returned to India while Vishu went on to get married again. In 1992, Vishu's first child from his second marriage was born, a son, Sachin Mehrotra, the narrator of the BBC podcast. In 1992, while the family was raising newborn Sachin, in a cruel twist of fate, people watched Princess Diana and Prince Charles separate in front of the world. The illusion of the perfect fairy tale romance, the illusion Vishal had also witnessed a decade ago as a baby, shattered like fragile glass. Then 1992 became 2002, and the world changed centuries. A new millennium was upon us. 5 years ago, the world had woken up to the news of Princess Diana's death in a car crash in Paris along with the man she loved. But by 2002, people had begun to forget that too. 2002 then became 2012. And 2012 became 2019. People who were Vishal's age back in 1981 and knew him back then were now in their late 40s with kids of their own and families of their own. His parents were now in their 70s. While the exact sound of Vishal's voice or the specific way only he laughed slowly became distant memories, the question of why Vishal, lingered on everyone's mind as sharp as the day he was found dead. And something was about to happen that very year, in 2019, almost 40 years after the disappearance, that would reignite hope for the Mehrotra family in ways nobody saw coming. Chapter 3. One word, Vishal. You remember Inspector Sean Keep? He was one of the 2 inspectors inside the Mehrotra home on the night Vishu filed the missing persons report for Vishal, the day of the wedding. That day was also his first day as a police officer. In a full circle moment, his last few days as a police officer were also going to be dedicated to Vishal. You see, by 2019, Inspector Keep had had an illustrious career as a detective for Scotland Yard, where he had this incredible knack for cracking cases police forces considered worthless because of how impossible they seemed to solve. But also, by 2019, he was on the verge of retirement, and so he was being called by police stations all over the country to help advise on cases that were seemingly incredibly hard. And one police station that called him for help was that of Sussex Police. Now, make no mistake, they didn't call him for Vishal's case specifically. They just called him to look over case files from the police department and see if anything stood out. And stood out, it did. When Inspector Keep was looking over the file of a case involving a group of pedophiles who had abused 18 kids in a boarding school called Montham House in Sussex, one specific page of that file ran a shiver down his spine. On that one page was the title of a thesis written by one of the main members of the pedophile group, Nicholas Douglas. And the title of this dissertation was one word, an Indian name, Vishal. Not a common name for anyone in the UK in the 1980s to know, much less use as the title of a dissertation. This name on that page seemed like a detail too big to ignore. This one link was huge to Sean, and even though he knew he'd be retiring soon, he wanted the right people in power to dive deeper into this monumental clue. And so he did all he could. He called a meeting of Sussex Police's most high-ranking officers and gave them all he had. And then he retired by the end of 2019, hoping they would take it from there. But months later, while in a conversation with one of his former colleagues, Inspector Keep learned something unfortunate. Sussex Police had chosen not to probe the detail further, shuffling Vishal's file back into the cold case folder. Turns out they did end up having conversations with the men from the pedophile gang, and when those men said they had nothing to do with Vishal's death, Sussex police just moved on. Quote, I was just quite disappointed, quite aghast. That was the level of response that Sussex police felt it needed. And I did feel that it was entirely inadequate. My personal view on this was that this little boy deserved better than just knocking on someone's door and basically saying, did you murder someone back in the 80s? Which is effectively what they did, I believe. This boy deserved a full team of energetic, enthusiastic, resourceful police officers who are trained, who've got access, who've got systems, is what Inspector Keep said in an interview. And so when Keep knew going back to Sussex police would turn out useless, he broke all police protocol and went to the next best option. An energetic, enthusiastic and resourceful local BBC journalist named Colin Campbell, who had been doing some incredible work exposing abuse by the church at the time. Described by Vishal Mehrotra as, quote, everything you'd want your local journalist to be, dogged, determined and committed, Colin Campbell received a call from an unknown phone number in May of 2020 as COVID began to spread throughout the world. This call was from Inspector Keep, who narrated to Colin everything he knew about Vishal's case and the new detail he had just stumbled upon. And Colin's interest was piqued immediately. Colin was actually born the same year as Vishal and so felt some unexplained affection for him, affection for the boy who would have been a man like him today had he been alive. For Colin, who described himself as not an investigative journalist, a natural step one was to visit Vishal's family, to visit Vishu and Sachin and get their account of Vishal's story. But when he visited Vishu's home in London, the hopelessness was palpable to Colin. Vishu was on guard, quizzing Colin on why he truly cared about Vishal. Because in 40 years since Vishal's death, Vishu was no stranger to reporters exploiting his son's story with no intention of truly helping the family.
They are potentially trying to brush this under the carpet.
But that day, Vishu sensed in Colin a sincerity, and Colin sensed the sorrow of a family that needed someone to do something, anything. And that's how Colin found himself in the depths of a murder story of a little Indian boy the world had forgotten. If step one was visiting Vishal's family, step two for Colin was now returning to the scene of the crime, the woods of Older Corps and the village nearest to it, called Rogate. At Older Corps, Colin invited someone to come with him to visit the site of the body. You see, Colin had learned that Detective Keep wasn't the only inspector working Vishal's case. There was another detective, Detective Jackie Moulton, the one who had given Vishu a hug that first night she met him. Jackie Moulton too, like Inspector Keep, had gone on to have an incredible career with the Metro Police and even became the inspiration for DCI Jane in the incredibly popular British drama series titled Prime Suspect. And so Colin called the now retired Detective Moulton and asked her to meet him at Older Corps, where the two found the site where Vishal's remains were discovered 40 years ago. In his first visit to the site, Colin described it as narrow, with a stream running through it but open fields on either side. A few houses exist around, but the spot is still isolated. It is during this meeting with Detective Jackie that Colin learns that she hasn't been able to forget Vishal all of these years, his case playing on her mind often. Both Colin and Detective Jackie Moulton decide that since only part of Vishal's remains were found that day in 1982, it's worth going back into the woods and searching again for anything else that may somehow still be there 40 years later. Colin, Detective Jackie Moulton and Detective Sean Keep also start getting on video calls together, going over the boxes full of documents Vishu had given Colin as a sign of trust and confidence in him. In those calls, the trio decided another good place to dig would be other students who were at that school in Sussex when the pedophiles were abusing the boys there. They wanted to start by creating a list of everyone, boys who were victims, boys who were witnesses, boys who were friends of the victims and witnesses, anyone and everyone they could get their hands on. The logic behind this was that maybe one or some of the boys who were at school at the time would remember some detail about the pedophiles that seemed similar to the ways in which Vishal was kidnapped and killed. Maybe, for example, some kid would remember how the pedophiles had picked up some boy from a lonely street, which would then show Colin and the detectives that the pedophiles had a history of doing something similar to what happened to Vishal. Slowly, the three began chipping away at the hundreds of documents, court filings, petitions, police reports, news articles that Vishu had given them, hoping for some detail to stand out. The more Colin dove deeper into all of these aspects of the case, the more sleepless he got over what truly happened to Vishal that day. And it was on one such sleepless night that Colin found something which would send him down a spiral. This is how Colin himself described what he saw. It's 4 in the morning. I'm lying awake, so I get up and make a cup of tea. One of the police reports is lying on my kitchen table. I pick it up and have another look. The early morning sunlight is shining in through the windows onto the paper, and I start to notice. I can see through the redacted sections. I can see the names of witnesses, including a man who says he saw people acting suspiciously at older cops, who was later hypnotized by the police. There's his name, the sun shining on it, clear as day, end quote. The name of this man was clear as day. His name was Nigel. When Colin met Nigel, he heard an astounding story. He was surprised the police hadn't probed more. While Nigel's memory of that one 1981 afternoon is hazy 40 years later, he's sure it was 1981, and he's sure it was soon after Vishal had disappeared in the summer of 1981, so July or August at the latest. At around lunchtime that day, 21-year-old Nigel was returning home from work, driving on an empty stretch of the 8272 road that runs right along Older Cops with no traffic in sight. So Nigel is driving, no traffic in sight. That was until he suddenly saw a black Lancia car parked at a really odd location on the opposite side of the road. He found it so odd, in fact, that he actually slowed down to see what was going on, if the passengers were okay. And as he slowed down, he says he saw 2 young, well-dressed Asian men in Older Cops right next to the road with fertilizer bags in their hands, while a third young, well-dressed Asian man stood next to the car smoking a cigarette, looking visibly nervous. At that moment, Nigel remembers thinking, these men are doing something they aren't supposed to be doing. This is all Nigel remembers from that day, and it was a detail he had even told the police back in 1981, after which the police asked him if he'd be willing to undergo hypnotherapy to help remember other details. And in hypnotherapy, Nigel remembered something else. He remembered that as he slowed down next to the car, he saw in the back seat a woman in what seemed like a sari. Today, Nigel has an inkling that those men were, at the very least, carrying Vishal's remains into the field in those fertilizer bags that day. Now, as Colin is talking to Nigel, something about this sari lady seems off. Because even though Nigel now, in 2020, says he remembers seeing Asian men and a woman in a sari, he said to the police back then that he saw Middle Eastern men, after which, at a different point in time, he said he saw men who looked like they were of European descent. Nigel in 2020 says that he doesn't quite remember the statements he gave 40 years ago, but he's certain he's always only said Asian men and a woman in a sari. Is this just Nigel's hazy memory, or an error on the part of the police in documenting his statement? Or is something truly weird about the story? We don't know. Neither does Colin, and a part of him now feels scared that Nigel's hazy memory may send him down a spiral that doesn't lead to Vishal at all, wasting his time. And so Colin goes back to the drawing board and does what he and the detectives discussed on their many video calls. Create lists of the students who studied at Mantham House in 1981, back when the pedophile ring and the abuse of boys shook the school to its core. And from this list emerged details so harrowing, they made everyone's skin crawl. This was the list that led Colin on a hunt to Asia for the man whom many to this day believe was the one responsible for the abduction, rape, and murder of Vishal Mehrotra. But to learn why and how a small little London school became the key to this case, you'll have to come back to part 2 of this episode. Until then, stay safe, stay crazy, and stay Desi.
If you like what we do here at Desi Studios and absolutely love what we're wearing today, this is merch you can go buy all for yourself.
You can buy this Desi Crime merch in our YouTube store on the link down below at Karak Merch. Keep the engines at Desi Studios rolling so we can pay our videographer right behind the camera to make these amazing episodes just for you.